One November morning in 1985, 4 women, Sanghadevi, Ratnashuri, Karunasri, Kulanandi, and a cat called Tansy, drove from London to the Welsh borders to start what was probably the first Buddhist retreat centre for women in the world. My name is Mythic, and I'm the current chair of Taraloka, the retreat centre that they founded 35 years ago. A few weeks ago, I interviewed the 3 remaining founders, and this is their story.
There were a number of women in the order who were involved in retreats, and we had a little retreat centre for a few years that a mitra had bought and given us the use of, and that had given us a kind of flavour of what it was like to have our own place for retreats. That was like in the late 70s, and we had to hand that property back. And so we'd always thought, oh, we will get our own place, but the thing was, we didn't feel we were ready yet to have our own place, because actually one of the difficulties we'd had with this little retreat centre we'd had for a few years was it was very hard to maintain a community there. And we thought, well, we just haven't got enough women in the order to set up another retreat centre. So we actually hired retreat venues, hired facilities to run retreats in for several years, which was actually, we had some really great retreats, and didn't really sort of suffer that much for not having our own place.
I think around the time we were thinking about Taraloka, we thought that this was probably the first retreat centre for women. I mean, certainly in Britain, I don't know about the rest of the world. And this idea of offering a retreat centre and offering the Dharma to other women and being able to live there myself was just very, very attractive, and seemed to me to be absolutely the next thing for me to do.
Bhante gave me that name, Sanghadevi, and the Sangha was, spiritual community. Sangha, something in me responded to there being a need to do something for the collective, in this sense, the collective of the women. I mean, that's just in terms of getting on the fundraising. It was much later that I actually thought, oh, I enjoy going on retreats. I enjoy being in the countryside. Oh, maybe I could consider moving to this place. It never occurred to me that I would live there. But, it was clear we needed something for the women to have as their own place, I suppose.
So for me, it was wanting to set up a facility that would benefit women all over the world, because I always tend to think, always have tended to think globally rather than locally. And, I like new projects. I liked getting things off the ground. I've always liked that I'm a starter-upper rather than a manager. So once things are up and running, I tend to lose interest. My interest starts to wane. But I like the, setting up something new or getting involved in something new. That's always what's been most appealing for me. But that was kind of in tandem with the wanting this sort of global facility for women in particular, because we had seasonal retreats, basically, sort of winter and summer, and that was it. We didn't have our own place, as it were.
But then I sort of did the maths and worked out it would take us years to raise the money to get our own facility, and we better start thinking about that. And that's how I ended up beginning to start raising money. I mean, it's more like I did the maths, we had a discussion, and someone turned to me and said, well, so will you do it? And I couldn't think of a good reason not to. This was just in terms of starting a fundraising thing. There was no question in my mind at that point I'd live in this place. Who knows who'd live there? I mean, I was terrified at the prospect of trying to raise money. And a quite senior male order member, took me out for a walk quite early on when he heard I was going to do this. And in the nicest possible way, said, I don't have confidence in this project because I haven't got confidence in you. Trying to be a fundraiser. And then he gave me some really helpful feedback. He said that it's just as egocentric to be self-effacing as it is to be pushy. And I was more on, at that time, believe it, I was more on the self-effacing side. And I thought, oh, all right, I've got to get over that if I'm going to try and raise money. But to be honest, I never was a very good fundraiser back then.
And because I was in London at the time, I heard about this project. So I actually ended up staying in London and moving to Vajrachedika, which is where Sanghadevi was living at the time, and starting to fundraise for Taraloka. I'm not even sure, to be honest, whether I was even a mitra at that point. I think I became a mitra much closer to the time that we moved to Taraloka, but I was very keen. And one of the reasons why I joined the Aid for India women's team was the opportunity to live and work with women. That was very, very important to me. So I really jumped at the chance of a possibility of living at Taraloka. I mean, you know, we didn't know what it was then, but the possibility of that, yeah.
So I was living in West London, around the West London Centre, and I lived in Saba City community with 7 other women where I'd been for about 5 years. And I was working in Friends Foods, which was our whole food shop in Notting Hill in West London at the time. At some point I got involved with the fundraising, but I don't know at what point, because I think the fundraising went on for about 3 years. And I just came in on the back end of that, I think. And that was based in East London. And I seem to remember we were the Women's Retreat Centre Fund, the WRCF. But I remember things like selling cakes and so on with Kulanandi in market stalls in the Isle of Dogs in London, places like that. And at the time, I was also working a day a week as a cleaner to partly support myself. So I'm not sure at what point I got involved with fundraising, but at some point I joined in with that, and I'd left Friends Foods.
The bulk of the money for Taraloka came from selling a cottage that we had been given. We'd actually used this cottage, White Row near Brighton, I think, for retreats, for small retreats. I remember going there for small GFR retreats myself. And the woman who owned the cottage was a mitra. And she gave us this cottage to sell, and with that money was really the most of the money donated towards Taraloka. And I mean, it was a huge thing to do, actually, and I don't think we could have bought Taraloka without that. We also did, I mean, Karunasri mentioned that, we also did lots of adventurous things to bring in money, none of which brought in as much money as this house, I have to say, but still, you know, it trickled in. And so I remember climbing up ladders to clean windows, and I remember cooking in the cherry orchard, as it was then, in the evenings, and selling things. And we had a sort of like a catering firm called Bananas, where we did outside catering. There are lots of little things that we did, and other people also helped us. It wasn't just the team, other people helped us. And I think actually Karunasri could probably say more, because we also got people, we tried to get quite famous people to be our patrons, I think you would say, yeah. So there were different things we tried to get the public involved as well and get some money in that way.
I think one of the people was Pamela Stevenson, and one of the mitras did cooking, always seemed to be involved cooking for her while she was traveling around performing or something like that. Kulanandi, does that ring?
I think so.
And we also managed to get some money from a trust to help buy some Dharma books. the Spalding Trust gave us 100 quid, which actually bought quite a few of our Pali Canon books at the time for the library. You know, the Mitra who was a significant benefactor when we were fundraising, her name was Diana McEwen. We were very fortunate.
Yeah, we were.
But I think we probably did raise about £50,000 as well.
I think we did. We was kind of raised half of it, didn't we?
I think we did.
But I think the fact that we had this money was such a boost. Such a boost.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things I do remember, I don't know if the others remember this, we got just an amazing deal on the mortgage. I don't know if you remember. We got a fixed mortgage, and it turned out that we'd really settled on a fantastic deal. And I think that really allowed Taraloka to take off financially, because that fixed mortgage was paid in next to no time.
That was quite amusing. I mean, I didn't remember about the fixed thing, but it was amusing when the bank, he was looking through the projections and he pointed to a particular sum of money, which basically showed that, you know, the four founders were going to live on virtually nothing, but it showed that we were going to be splitting Ratnashiri's pension between us, spending money. I remember him looking at, which was £10 each, you know, and him looking at me and saying, you know, do you really think you can live like that? And I said, oh, yes, we definitely can. And, you know, I think it, you know, he must have had a lot of confidence in us, because it was a very weird proposition, you know, that most of the income would be paying for other stuff. We weren't going to get anything really. But yeah, he gave us a £50,000 mortgage.
And we did have £10 a week pocket money.
And we did have £10.
So when we moved to Taraloka in 1985, I was 33. So all of us at that point were pretty much half Ratnashiri's age. So Ratnashiri was 62 when we arrived at Taraloka in 1985. And obviously she came with her black cat Tansy. And she'd moved from Norwich to Croydon about a year before we started. So she had some experience of community living, as I remember. And she was the only order member who volunteered to come with Sanghadevi. So she's got, you know, obviously her heroic qualities, but she'd only been ordained for 2 years herself. And she was our cook. She made lunch and dinner every day. She'd got a catering experience from Orange's restaurant in Norwich. And she didn't always want to be cooking, but she just got on with it, cooking on a sort of glorified camping gas stove with a couple of burners, I remember, to start with, to cook her. And Ratnashiri, as we probably all know, was fiery and artistic. But I think one of the things we really benefited from, and I said this at her funeral, was that she had the wisdom that comes with age that we couldn't possibly have in our 30s, because we just didn't have that perspective on life. And so she had that perspective that comes with aging. And I think that was very helpful for us. And I thought of us being like three little boats bobbing about on very rough water. And Ratnashiri was this little calm boat tied up in the harbour on very smooth water. And Ratnashiri led and was on many retreats, particularly meditation retreats that she loved. And from Taraloka, she went off to India after a couple of years to ordain women publicly on Bante's behalf, and obviously afterwards ordained many others privately and publicly. But I think the other thing I was just going to mention was she was also a real champion for older women coming on retreat, and she did, you know, run lots of retreats for older women, and was a real champion for them in general.
Well, of course, I had been inside the house a few times because I'd had to go up there and be part of, with the guy who was doing the survey and stuff. So, I mean, the house itself was shabby, run down, dark, gloomy, very basic. Kind of sad. I think it felt it had a bit slightly sad feeling inside it. Because the owners, the farmers they had to move because they'd gone bankrupt, and it was a sad time for them. Yeah, and it was the winter, so everything looked grey. And I mean, the outbuildings, were a mess, and they looked a mess. But I mean, it just felt exciting. I wasn't bothered. I mean, it was like, hey, this is our place, and we can do what we like. So.
I remember us getting out of the car and needing a cup of tea because we'd driven up from London and there was no water. So obviously we looked for the stopcock, which we couldn't find. So we had no water, and we ended up having to phone the farmer to find out how to turn on the water. And we would never have found it because I don't know if you know this, but the stopcock is down the end of the track in the bank in the lane. By the way, in fact. That's one of my first immediate impressions. We need a cup of tea, it's no water.
Yeah, and I do remember, I don't know whether this is a later memory, but I remember Karunasri putting some geraniums on the windowsill in the lobby, by the front door. And it really changed things, just having these. And even though it was November, there was still some colour there. I do remember that. Yeah, because actually a couple of days it was warm enough to sit out when we first got there. But we lived in boiler suits, I have to say. I'm not even quite sure whether we didn't sleep in boiler suits too, but we certainly lived in them during the day. That was our uniform. Yeah.
That woman, Penny, was a real blessing. She just literally turned up in London about 3 weeks before we moved to Cornhill Farm, and she was a builder with building skills. I mean, none of the rest of us had any skills like that. And I mean, I don't know what we'd have done if she hadn't turned up. She actually knew how to knock down a wall without, losing half the building, which is very useful.
We were all townies. We didn't know anything about living in the country. And I remember at one point we found all these big holes around the house, and we thought, oh, how we've got rabbits. And actually we had giant rats running around the place. We didn't have a clue. We also had a very erratic heating system that had to be filled constantly. So my memory is we either had radiators jumping off the wall because they were so hot, or they were stone cold and we were freezing. I had to learn how to chainsaw logs to keep feeding this. It was almost like a monster, wasn't it? They all boiled. Kulanandi and I did that between us in our boiler suits, of course.
I remember the boiler was called Fred.
Well, now this is where we disagree. Kulanandi, it was called Fred. For myself, it was called Aurora. And I think it was named Aurora by Rupavati.
Yeah. Well, another little mundane point, Karunasri, I don't know, and Sanghadevi, I don't know if you remember, but the library floor went like this, do you remember? Because they had a huge, great big piece of wooden furniture and the floor collapsed. And Penny spent many weeks in the cellars, putting bricks under the floor.
We discovered we had a cellar.
Well, I don't think we always got on very well. I think that's the honest point. I remember saying to myself, well, the first 2 weeks there were heaven. I was in heaven the first 2 weeks, and then it went downhill all the way. I remember. I think that's a quote from me, and I think it was just. I mean, we're all dealing with so many difficult things. It was such a new situation. you know, we had to get, I think we were working towards getting the Christmas retreat because we needed the money basically. So we were working towards the Christmas retreat and we had all this work to do. And, you know, we had a lot of decisions to make. And I think, you know, and we were all dealing with the uncertainties and the insecurities of being in this new place and not really knowing each other. I think, you know, Karunasri had joined the Vajrachedika community, hadn't you, towards the end, and Ratnashuri as well. And Sanghadevi and I had lived together for a couple of years. But I think we're all dealing with a lot internally and also externally. And the pressure was on. The pressure was on. I don't think I've ever worked so hard in the whole of my life. Yeah. And I remember you rolling out the carpets before the people arrived for the Christmas retreat, and we were still putting up lampshades. And I remember friends of mine coming on the Christmas retreat and saying we all look completely mad. We just look completely mad. Yeah. So there wasn't a lot of emphasis on like a community because, you know, we just didn't have the time to think about things like that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I do remember Kulanandi really suffering and hitting a wall proverbially, you know, a few weeks in, and also she had the misfortune of having a tractor drove into the side of our lovely second-hand estate Peugeot within like weeks of arriving, which was a really awful thing to experience happening. Yeah, I mean, I think we just worked absolutely flat out because it was very tight. I mean, it was like 5 weeks we had or something before the 3 weeks of the Christmas retreat. So I mean, we just worked, ate and slept basically. But yeah, I mean, we were clueless, and I include myself, clueless about how to build community. So we just stumbled along. I mean, I think it's credit to the fact that all of us were very inspired by the vision. And that's one of the things that it showed me, that if you have a vision that's strong enough and people are behind it enough, somehow or other you do get through things. You know, you kind of stick together because you really believe in it. And that's what happened, I think, with us, as the three of us particularly who are being interviewed now. I mean, we believed in the project enough that we stuck together, you know, actually for several years, you know, even though at times, you know, in different combinations, we really struggled with our communication with each other. I mean, if we hadn't had that vision, we'd have left. Why would we stay? But we had that vision, and it was a very strong unifying factor between us, actually.
And I don't remember thinking about how much work there was to do. It was just exciting to get started and do whatever, you know, we needed doing. And I know in those early weeks, somewhere in the depths of winter, we needed an office space. And Kulanandi and I went down to somewhere near Shrewsbury to some caravan site. And the River Severn was flooding at the time around the edge of the caravan site. And I remember buying this caravan, the caravan rolling down the track. And then we've got this caravan for our office, but then we've got to set it up so it actually is a functioning space. So I suppose part of the early days was, if we wanted something done, we had to make it happen. And that in itself was exciting, you know, because there was this constant kind of process of creating the new, you know, the farm had a load of, like Kulanandi said, sort of concrete and so on, just junk, farm junk lying around. So, you know, just clearing that sort of stuff away and creating the land, I suppose, for our own project. So whatever it was, we had to kind of make it happen. And I suppose I mean, it's kind of, we've said before, but we were the four that put our heads above the parapet and said, okay, we'll go. But there were loads of people who helped from, you know, straight after we got there, whether they came for, you know, 2 days, 2 weeks, 6 months or whatever. So there were lots and lots of other people involved. And in a way, I always think that was part of the problem with our community, that we were a nucleus of 4 people, but we didn't really live together as a community. We always had a lot of other people come in. I think the most at one point was about 13 of us in the community. So we were. It was kind of what was needed, but it was also part of the problem because there was a constant change of personnel. So it was hard to kind of create our own sense of self, if you like.
I mean, there had been various ideas mooted as a name before we'd moved. I mean, and that was coming from people in the order, mitras, people making suggestions. I think Bante even offered 1 or 2 suggestions, and none of them felt right. So we just kind of accepted the fact, well, we were going to move there and it was called Cornhill Farm, and we just had to trust that something would turn up right after we moved. And I don't know when it was, how early it was after we moved, but basically I was in the bathroom, the downstairs bathroom off the kitchen at Taraloka in the community house, cleaning my teeth, and an image came into my mind of this friend I had called Jaya Pushpa, who was a Malaysian woman who'd got ordained and who I'd lived with in London for a few years during her training for ordination. And she had taken up the green Tara practice. And I associated her very strongly in my mind with Tara. And somehow it just all happened in a sort of single moment. There was Jaya Pushpa, Tara, Taraloka. And as soon as Taraloka, it's just like, well, of course, obvious, why on earth? How come we've never thought of this before? It just seems so utterly obvious. So I don't know how I communicated. Presumably I shared it with Karunasri and Kulanandi and Ratnashri and others. And anyway, I mean, yeah, basically communicated it. People liked it, and Bante gave his blessing to it. And I mean, I think it was just an amazing blessing, really, because to me, I don't know, it just gave us the kind of heart myth of the place, which was what it was really about. And I certainly believed in that really, really strongly, creating Tara's realm for the benefit of, well, anyone who came there, anyone who passed through there, heard about it.
I think I'd been very successful in the world in my life, but Taraloka presented me with a completely different challenge. And I think in a way, it surprised me, and it made me see that how I'd been living before, the confidence or the self-confidence I thought I had was actually just built on sand. And I had to grow something else inside me. So I think, for me, it was an absolute crucial part of my spiritual life, absolutely crucial. And I think one of the things that I learned at Taraloka was also to, well, I have to say this, I think I learned a lot from Sanghadevi I'll mention 2 things I learned that because I'm living in quite a big community at the moment, and I still come back to these things, that often when we were around the table, we would often talk about the food, then we talk about the contents of the food, then we talk about what Tansi had been up to. I remember Sanghadevi, taking us a little bit to task and sort of inviting us to talk about other things. But I could see that she had a long-term vision for this. It wasn't going to change in the next few days. And I think I learned to have this long-term vision for things rather than wanting things a certain way immediately. That I found very inspiring. Also, when I was ordained, Sanghadevi really allowed me to spread my wings. And I remember being encouraged to lead retreats. I was a very young order member and very inexperienced, but being encouraged to lead retreats and get confidence. And often I would lead and Sanghadevi would support me. And these were things that I feel like I can pass these on as an order member, as a Kalyana Mitra. And yeah, they really allowed me to take off and to leave Taraloka and to move into something completely different in a very positive way. So, you know, Taraloka feels for me in many ways like a spiritual home, although I'm not often there and haven't been there for quite a long time. But there's something very, very precious and special to me about the fact that Taraloka exists and it's ongoing. You know, I'm always interested to hear what goes on there, and it feels, yeah, very much part of my life, very active part of my life.
I just touch on some of the things that I found difficult, which were things like, you know, because as Kulanandi was saying, we didn't always get on. And I think one of the things was being so far away from other friends and family that were down south, and there was just us in the middle of a field, in the middle of nowhere. So, you know, we kind of had to make it work. And I think looking back, you know, which is obviously much easier to do than at the time, is that we were all individually very capable. And we all had ideas and opinions and whatever. And at times that just caused friction and tension, I think. But at the same time, we all needed to be very capable because we had to get the thing happening. But I think that was part of the issue. Kulanandi and I, obviously, we were ordained roles at Taraloka by Banti in 1988. So being there was a significant part of ordination process. And we literally became different people while we were there. So my main teaching for myself that I came away with, which is actually as interesting, Sanghadevi said pretty much the same thing, was that what I always say to people as well, that if you have a strong enough vision of what you want to achieve between you, you can transcend your personal difficulties because you're all going in the same direction, despite all these kind of clashes on the way. You all want the same thing. You know, I think we were all very, very much clear about the direction that we were going and what we wanted to achieve. So I think that did kind of overrule the personal clashes that we had, you know, much as, you know, obviously we would have rather done without them, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was, I found it very, very painful when there were quite serious communication difficulties arising between me and some other people in the community. But it was a kind of a growing up for me, because it was like having to, I mean, one of the things I learned through some of the difficulties, particularly with, you know, my co-founders, was that I had to really respect other people's processes, and in a way, the way other people dealt with the difficulties from their side, i.e. I couldn't force a resolution or force a kind of a solution, or let's talk this through and get over it sort of thing. I had to just bear with whatever was the other person's process. And actually that meant I had to dig a lot deeper into my own personal practice and not look to that other person to reassure me that I was an all right person, and, you know, but, you know, despite the difficulties, I was lovable and all that kind of stuff that goes on, you know, because I was deeply insecure, actually. So that, yeah, it was tough, but I kind of feel I learned quite a lot about myself and other people in that process. I mean, I think the highs were some of the retreats we did and some of the retreats I participated in or played a part in leading or co-leading, and there was a lot of you know, increasingly, I suppose there was a lot of creativity flowing through the retreat centre that, you know, it was just coming from all the different order members and others who contributed. You know, as Karunasri said, they didn't all live at Taraloka. Loads of people came and helped us, and yeah, there was something quite miraculous happening, it felt like. And yeah, I suppose for me, I suppose what I took away through that, the realm, through the myth, you know, it felt like that really opened me up to the mythic dimension. I suppose it made it more conscious in me that actually myth mattered, and that the myth of Tara mattered. And and that there was something I was playing a part in that was much bigger than me. And I somehow Taraloka created a focus for me to become more aware of that as how I needed to live my life, and that if I wasn't living my life within a myth, actually I really suffer. So yeah, Taraloka itself was a keystone for that for me, and is still a kind of, you know, touchstone of that truth, I suppose. I think I didn't say right at the beginning that my vision was for a retreat centre which had a broad-based appeal. That was a quite conscious intention in terms of how we set it up. We wanted it to cater for not only women already involved in Tree Ratna, but also newer women and newcomers. Yeah, not just specialising in one type of retreat. That was quite a deliberate part of the vision back then.
I'm like Kulanandi. I feel Taraloka is very much in my heart. You know, it's very much part of who I am, although it's a long time since I've been there because it's a long way from where I live. But I'm still, you know, I'm always interested to hear about it and get the newsletters. And although there are now places for women to go on retreat all over the world, there didn't used to be. So, you know, I still find it, you know, in your Taraloka newsletter, sometimes women will comment on their experience of having been on retreat, and I find that quite moving just to sort of hear that it's still carrying on. You know, that's really important, and yeah, you know, I still feel you know, that I'm still part of Taraloka even though I'm not there, if that makes sense, because it was such a, you know, a formative and crucial time in our personal lives, but also, you know, in the women's wing particularly, but in the movement as a whole.